Welcome back. Today we're looking at Dante's Paradiso again, and we're looking at the planet Mars. In our last video, we were on the surface of the sun, and we were talking about the virtue of wisdom. And here in Canto 14, up through Canto 17, we're going to be looking at Mars, and we're going to be talking about the virtue of courage. Now this is one of my favorite sections of the entire Divine Comedy. It's really great. But before we get into Mars, we still have one more little thing to do on the surface of the sun in Canto 14. So Canto 14 is going to begin right where Thomas Aquinas finished speaking in Canto 13 that we looked at last time. And as he finishes speaking, Beatrice is going to respond immediately, and it gives this lovely metaphor of ripples spreading across a pond. And Beatrice, knowing what Dante is thinking, because all the souls up here, the pure souls, can read Dante's mind, she asked a question for Dante. The first part of the question is, will your light continue forever? This light that you're shining as souls up here. And second, when you receive your bodies again in the resurrection, how will that affect you? Won't that hurt your eyes, how bright you are, etc.? And the souls, in response to the question, with the joy of being able to answer Dante, dance and sing. As impelled and drawn by heightened joy, dancers and around may raise their voices, their pleasure showing in their movements. So at that eager and devout appeal, the holy circle showed new joy in wheeling as well as in their wondrous song. Whoever here on earth laments that we must die to find our life above, knows not the fresh relief found there in these eternal showers. And there's a moment here where he's coming to accept the power of the afterlife. Those people who lament and sorrow over death here on earth don't understand the true joy that comes in the afterlife. And as their movement continues, of course, it reiterates that sign of the Trinity that we've seen so much on the sun here. And then, instead of Thomas Aquinas answering, it's Solomon who answers. And some of the commentators, such as Hollander, have noted that Solomon's response here has this beautiful eloquence, this beautiful poetry that sounds very much like perhaps the Song of Songs that Solomon is so famous for, as opposed to Thomas Aquinas' more didactic kind of speech. And Solomon explains that their bodies will continue to glow, and will actually even glow brighter once they receive their bodies again. But their eyes will be strengthened to be able to endure it. And there's this circular description of the way that their knowledge and their joy increases, which increases their brightness, which increases further their ability. When we put on again our flesh, glorified and holy, then our persons will be more pleasing for being all complete, so that the light granted to us freely by the highest good shall increase, the light that makes us fit to see him. From that light, vision must increase, and love increase what vision kindles, and radiance increase, which comes from love. So there's the cycle of increased vision, increased understanding, and through that, the ability to increase your love. And the increased love increases brightness, etc. At the end of Solomon's speech, all of the souls glow even more brightly and sing an amen because they're so excited about the idea of getting their bodies back. And it says not just for themselves, but for their mothers, for their fathers, and for others whom they loved before they all became eternal flames. There's this joy and this sense of unity. Again, that idea that we saw in the last video of unity being a big part of wisdom, working together. It's not just about me knowing so much. In fact, it's the sharing of understanding that really brings about wisdom. We saw how so many people with even differing ideas and conflicts of ideas who are ultimately able to, through meaningful discussion of these ideas, draw closer to wisdom, and so coming together and unifying. And then Dante has this vision of a third ring. If we remember from the last video, there are 2 rings of souls in the sun, and all of a sudden this third ring seems to appear around it. And it no longer has just the 12, in fact it has a huge multitude. And it's kind of vague and it's never fully explained. But it seems to finish that image of the Trinity, 3 rings. And the third ring seems to represent the Holy Spirit. And it's so bright that Dante can't look at it anymore, so he turns to Beatrice. And there, seeing Beatrice, her smile is so beautiful that he's no longer able to remember it now. And we have this concept that's explored again and again and again in Paradiso, and even more so as we get farther along. There are things that Dante cannot speak because they are beyond description. And then there are things that Dante cannot remember. He remembers them happening, but he cannot keep the image in his mind because it's beyond memory. And then there are those things that he cannot even look at. He couldn't even take in at the moment. So his speech is limited, his memory is limited, and his ability to understand and take things in is limited because of his mortality. But Beatrice showed herself to me so fair and smiling, this vision of her must remain among those sights that have escaped my memory. And at that moment, suddenly he looks around himself and he finds that he's been transported to Mars, and it's glowing red. He calls the glow the planet's fiery smile. And as he sees it, he is so overcome by the glory of this that he praises God. He's moved to offer a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving. And he specifically uses the term sacrifice, like a burnt offering, with all my heart and in that tongue, which is the same for all I made, burnt offering to God, befitting the new grace. And the burning of the sacrifice had not yet finished in my breast before I knew my offering was propitious and accepted. For splendors of such brightness, glowing red, appeared to me within two beams, that I cried out, O Helios, who so adorned them. And so he sees these two beams in this moment of outpouring of thanksgiving and praise. He sees these two beams across Mars. And they're beams of red light, and they have, as he sees in just a moment, they have these lights moving within them. And these lights are the souls. So these two beams are actually made up of glowing souls. And these two beams form a cross, which establish the initial idea of Mars. The cross, of course, reminds him of Christ. In fact, he sees the perfect image of Christ in that cross. But it's also connected in just a moment to the idea of the crusader. And we get to the key idea for Mars, which is the idea of courage. Now, Mars traditionally is associated with war. And so we see the idea of Mars, god of war, who's going out and causing battle or leading people into battle. And Dante's not going to go that route with Mars here. There is a courage, but it's not necessarily courage in battle, it's courage to do what's right. And Dante's going to link the idea of Mars to the idea of the martyr, someone who dies for a cause. So there's a big contrast with somebody like, say, Alexander the Great, who we saw in the Inferno, among those who live in violence to others, those whose lives are battle and bloodshed. Rather, this is someone who's willing to die for a purpose. As Dante is watching this cross and these souls moving within it, he hears their song and he cannot take it in, again, for the same reasons that we've seen before, that ineffability. He can't fully understand it, but he does catch some words, and those words are arise and conquer, again tied in with that virtue of courage. And Dante is so moved by this that he says, I was moved to such great love by this, that up until that moment I had not been bound by chains so sweet and gentle. But then he immediately apologizes for that, saying, I don't mean that Beatrice's smile was any less beautiful, or that I'm slighting her. I'm so sorry. He has to keep returning to Beatrice's face. But he explains that he hasn't looked at Beatrice yet since they've been on Mars. So he knows that she's become even more beautiful, since every time they move up, she's become more beautiful. Yeah, Dante, we get it. We've heard that a few times. We move into Canto 15, and Dante says how the beauty of the song is silenced for him. Which we might start to read as a bad thing, but he points out that there is a graciousness and a benevolent goodwill that brings joy to the souls in ceasing their song for a moment to answer his questions and to talk to him. And he draws the point here that of the effectiveness of prayer, the idea that a prayer will bring about good things, and that an answer to a prayer is not an annoyance to the divine, but rather something to celebrate. And Dante also draws out the fact that eternal love and divine love has different priorities than sort of simple temporal love. And as Dante's looking at this cross, he sees one of these lights moving like a shooting star, and he goes into the whole thing about what a shooting star is, but he sees this light moving down the cross towards him. And Dante makes the connection with Aeneas going into the underworld and finding the soul of his father there in the underworld in Virgil's Aeneid. This soul seems to reach out to him like Aeneas' father reached out to him. With such affection did Anchises' shade reach out, if our greatest muse is owed belief, when in Elysium he knew his son. It's going to emphasize over and over and over this idea of fatherhood, because the figure that Dante's about to talk to is Cacciaguida, who is his great-great-grandfather. And Dante's going to draw a lot of parallels between Cacciaguida and some of the other father figures in the Divine Comedy. Particularly with Virgil, who is, of course, a father to Dante throughout the first two parts of this poem, but also to Brunetta Latini, who was a sort of false father figure in the Inferno. And it's funny because the very first thing that Cacciaguida says is actually in Latin, which reminds us both of the Latin Vulgate of the Bible and also the Latin of Virgil. He takes the place of both a Christian father and a Virgilian father, a father of poetry and a father of faith to Dante. And Dante turns and sees Beatrice smile again, because we've got to do that in between every single thing we do. And then the soul begins to speak to Dante again, but this time Dante doesn't understand because he is speaking a language of joy and beyond human understanding. And he finally switches back to Italian and thanks God in Italian for allowing him to see what has become of his seed, his descendant here. And Dante's gotten used to the whole moving through paradise thing where he doesn't ever have to talk, hardly. Dante says less and less in this section, mostly because anything he wants to know, he just looks at the souls and they read his mind and understand him. But here we're going to say a few more things about language, and part of that is, even if you can understand what someone wants, it's better to be phrased sometimes. Cacciaguida is so eager to hear Dante's voice that he asks Dante to ask the question, who he is, even though he knows what Dante wants to know. You think your thoughts flow into mine through him who is the first, as from the number 1 will radiate the 5 and 6 if one is known. For that reason you do not ask me who I am, nor why I seem to you more filled with joy than any other in this happy throng. And you are right, for the humble and the mighty up here in this life gaze into the mirror in which before you think them, thoughts shine clear. But that the sacred love which keeps me watching with enduring vision and makes me thirst with sweet desire may be more happily fulfilled. Let your voice resound sure, bold, and joyfully, to proclaim the will, proclaim the desire, for which my answer is already set. So I already know what I'm going to say to you, Dante, when you ask this question, but I just really want to hear you ask it, because it will fill my joy even more full. And we've got this continued metaphor of wings, and Dante being given wings, which is an interesting image, especially considering that we're going to connect it to a couple of flyers. We have Icarus with his failed flight, and in a moment we're also going to pull up the image of Phaeton, both of whom are mythic figures who failed in flight. But Dante is not failing in flight. He's soaring through the heavens, but he's being helped and carried along the way, and a big part of that has to do with Beatrice, who he's constantly looking to for guidance. And Cacciaguida here has already noted that it's her wings that have carried him up here. And Dante points out that his mortal limits keep him from the ability to thank Cacciaguida as he ought to, but he asks Cacciaguida's name. And Cacciaguida says, "O bough of my tree, in whom I have rejoiced, even in expectation, I was your root." Such was the preface of his words to me. And then he's going to begin and talk about Florence for a while. And he talks about the way Florence has changed. Back in Cacciaguida's day, he says, Florence wasn't so crazy. It wasn't so flashy. There was a modesty and a humility about Florence. Part of that came from the fact that the people lived more simply. And Cacciaguida really celebrates the past and its simplicity. And he talks about, in contrast, the way Florence is today, with lots of flashy clothes, flashy jewelry, people making themselves look really cool. But also along with that, there is two big problems. One is the huge amount of trade that's going on with Florence, which means that the households are split. While the women live at home in luxury and all this flashiness, the men are out in France doing trade. But also, by extension, the homes and families are torn apart by war and by violence. There is a lack of unity and a lack of togetherness. Just nice, simple home living. And finally, after a while, that Cacciaguida tells his name and how he was baptized, and he also tells just a couple quick things about his family, and ultimately what became of him, which is that he became a knight and then went on the Second Crusade. So he's a crusader. There we have the link to the Crusader's Cross that we saw when we first approached Mars. And there we see Cacciaguida as a courageous hero who goes out and fights for what he believes in. And there he actually died in the middle of the Second Crusade. And so, as Dante points out, he achieved martyrdom. And so we come to Canto 16, in which Dante is going to open with the idea of family pride.